You couldn't make this stuff up. I've just heard on the radio that Rule Britannia, that classic patriotic song, people are now calling for it to be cancelled, to be banished from society, even written out of history, certainly never played and never celebrated ever again. Because in Rule Britannia, it repeats in the lyrics many times that Britons will never be slaves. Now this apparently is offending people deeply. Why? Do they want Britons to say, we want to be enslaved? No. What we will never be slaves, Britons will never be slaves, means, bear in mind it was written in about the 1740s, it means that Britain will never give up. It will never give in. It will never be beaten by an enemy. It will never surrender. And at the time, during the 18th century, of course, Britain was almost constantly at war with France. And so, it will never surrender, ever. We will never be enslaved. And it was that mantra, that attitude, which was employed during the Second World War under Winston Churchill, which I believe, and I'm sure, I'm asking you, do you believe, helped Britain get through that war? God forbid we ever had a situation today with the politicians we have today, and a huge percentage of our population who would just stick their hands up in the air and surrender immediately at the drop of a hat. How did we get to this point? But back to the song, Rule Britannia, and this very idea that it should be abolished, particularly from the BBC Last Night of the Proms. Now this is a yearly event in London, a big celebration of music, is Rule Britannia, and this is where everyone gets flags and they're waving the flags and wearing Unijack hats, and it's a great celebration of music and yes, of Britain. Why not? Britain should be proud of its past when it comes to slavery. Now, I know a lot of you will be absolutely hitting the roof now. I accept that Britain was heavily involved in the transatlantic slave trade, as very many European countries were. And, by the way, if you didn't know, very many African slave states. The vast majority, it's just a fact, of Africans who were sold into slavery and made their way across the Atlantic, that terrible, mind-bogglingly awful journey. The vast majority were captured by fellow Africans and sold by Africans to European traders. Now this, to our ears, sounds abominable. To most in the 18th century it was abominable, but it went on. You've just got to accept this was history. So we attempt, if we can, to learn from history, and the British certainly learn from history, because after several decades of great demands from the British public, Britain was the very first nation on the planet, the first major nation, to abolish slavery, not just in Britain but across her empire. And the British Empire was the first empire in the history of the world to say no to slavery. But Britain didn't only do that, by the way. Britain spent at least 60 years fighting slavery and funding the fight against slavery. The cost of this was so great to the British during the 19th century that it's only in recent years that the British taxpayer has finally paid off that bill. But it's not always about money, by the way. There was a lot of money involved, but there was a lot of lives lost as well in fighting the slave trade. Thousands of British sailors died in the West African Fleet, that fleet, part of the Royal Navy that toured up and down the west coast of Africa, stopping the slave ships and bringing the African slave states to heel, to bring the trade to an end. They also went to the other side of Africa, to Zanzibar, and brought the East Africa slave trade. This is with the trade between Arabia and Africa. They brought that to the end in the 1870s as well. So this is it's a huge story, and it's one that these people today that are so deeply offended by the lyrics in Rule Britannia, where Britons are saying, we will never be enslaved by anybody, they don't either know these facts or they simply brush them under the carpet. bonkers to me that these people don't understand what the slave trade is. The trade has been going on since man set foot on earth. It's as old as any occupation, being a slave trader. It's been going forever. But get this, how many people know this? Even though the British abolished the slave trade during the 19th century, it's still going on today. In the 21st century, it is estimated that there are 40 million people in the world living as slaves. And these aren't people necessarily all in far-flung countries working in, or not working, forced to work in factories, farms, production units, whatever. There are also people working in the West, maybe working next door to you, maybe working in the next street. Certainly, if you live in a city, certainly there are many slaves living in your city. But it blows my mind. It's bonkers. And it proves that we are now living in a certainly what I refer to as a post-common sense world. It blows my mind that these same people that bang on about the past, that shout at history, point the finger of blame, ignore the fact that there are slaves living amongst them. And so it's over to you. Let me know what you think. Should we give in? Should Britons enslave themselves to these people who demand that Rule Britannia should be abolished and banished from society? So over to you. What do you think about Rule Britannia? Should it be abolished or should it be celebrated?